Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. In the midst of all the end-of-year video violence on BookTube, I found an opening to make a video I've been wanting to make for quite a while. This is going to be one of my most personal videos to date. These on-the-side videos where I talk about book-related subjects outside of fantasy are not the most popular on this channel. Still, I hope some of you can appreciate this non-fantasy content with a philosophical twist. Apparently, they are part of this Dutch Greybeard. In 2013, a good friend of mine introduced me to this book, Flirten met God, Religiositeit, zonder geloof, by Koert van de Velde, which would translate as Flirting with God, Religiosity without faith. Not exactly your typical holiday book that you want to pick up in every last minute just to see how the story progresses. This is more the kind of book that presents you with a thought or surprise on almost every page, which sharpens one's mind. After reading this book, I felt prompted to write an essay about it, just to capture for myself the in-depth thinking this book provoked in me. In this video, I want to share the shorter version of that essay, for whom it may concern, of course. To my knowledge, the book has not been translated into English, so hopefully this video will in a way correct that omission. Let me start by briefly outlining what flirting with God is about. According to Van der Velde, the inability to believe has grown in our society, while the religious desire has remained. He says, many people no longer believe in the existence of, for example, God or life after death. According to a study in 1997, only 6% of Dutch people still see some meaning in religion. At the same time, other studies clearly show that it is no longer self-evident that people think about philosophical topics. The author asks himself whether it is possible to have religious experiences without faith, or in his words, how can someone without faith but with religious desires have a religious experience? By faith he means that someone holds something to be true, that he or she will never be able to know during his or her lifetime. And by religiosity, he means all experiences, feelings, attitudes and actions that used to be connected with belief in traditional religious ideas. Van der Velde tackles his study at its roots and works it out in detail. Reading this book implored me to think about my own concept of God. Since I was a small child, I've had this incessant tendency to pose questions about meaning and about my role and quest, if you will, in this realm. So where do I fit in regarding God, faith and all that? I would like to describe myself as a spiritually inspired agnostic. At the end of all my ponderings and reading books, I always have to conclude that I simply don't know if there is anything as a conscious continuation after death, let alone what that may look like. For me, the sum of all the natural laws come together in God, or the supreme architect of the universe, or whatever you wish to call her, him, or it. The innumerable amount of unspeakable, mystical and numinous experiences I've been lucky to have encountered in life so far feeds the spirituality in me. I simply cannot believe that this maelstrom that we call life is a coincidence. What it is, where it comes from, and what it is for is far too big to be encompassed by the human brain. I'm interested in the concept of reincarnation, near-death experiences, and so-called unexplainable phenomenon like Edgar Cayce. My thinking on faith and the meaning of life has not reached its limits, and it is continuously in progress. It's obvious that I fall into the category of people who desire deeper meaning or the experience of something divine. I would like to quote a small passage from my novel, De Vergeten Muze or The Forgotten Muse. The small part I'll be quoting is about 99% autobiographical. The underwater period of blessed ignorance in my dreamy youth was of course doomed to be disrupted. The first realization that there was an impassable gap between my dream world and reality sailed into my mind around the age of 6 or 7. One weekday afternoon, my father took me to see my grandparents. My toddler's eyes mistook the coma in which my grandmother lay for a peaceful afternoon nap. Her glasses were on the bedside table and she was breathing heavily. After we had stood silently at the foot of the bed for a few minutes, my father sank to my height. "Say goodbye to Grandma," he said. Without thinking too much about it, I did as I was told. "Bye, Grandma." Once outside, the fire of questions erupted. Why didn't Grandma wake up? What does not being there anymore mean? How high up in the air was heaven? Could I go there if I wanted to see Grandma? Would I also become an angel if I went to heaven? Why didn't she say bye back? Did Grandpa have to cook his own food now? She must have died shortly after this. Not long after this, the sense of mortality must have descended upon me. One day, death would happen to me too, even though that was still a long way off. This discovery wouldn't let go of me and degenerated into an obsession that held me in its stranglehold for a long time. Even though true fear of death hardly ever catches me off guard anymore nowadays, I still postpone going to bed as long as possible. In my youth, going to bed was the most fearful moment of the day when, in the silence and darkness of the coming night, the first question would pop into my head. What would it actually be like to be dead? This inevitable moment was the prelude to a breathtaking attack of anxiety. Where am I when I am dead? Am I then still? And if so, in what capacity? And how long will that kind of existence last? 100 years or 100 million years? How long is that? And after that, what happens? When did time begin? When does time cease to exist? Where is the end of space? As if on a rickety roller coaster, I raced, lying in bed, my center and only hold, through time and space, looking for an end or a beginning, for a way out. These anxiety attacks are part of my youth. Fortunately, as the years went by, they occurred less frequently and became less intense, until eventually my resistance was broken. I will not escape this dance either. Koert van der Velde sees a growing need for religious experience. While Christianity as a social phenomenon keeps on shrinking, the desire for meaning grows. Religious rapture doesn't offer a solution or answers, but it does offer comfort. Van der Velde describes a religious experience he had when he climbed the mountain in the Sinai desert from which Moses is said to have descended with the stone tablets. I too have had some deeply religious experiences. One day, for instance, waiting for my train, I strolled to the end of the station platform where I looked out over the many train tracks that stretched out in front of me. Out of nowhere, a feeling of absolute knowing came over me. It was suddenly completely clear to me that there was a meaning. What that meaning was remained beyond my grasp, but that was no longer relevant at all. Simply knowing absolutely that there was a meaning was enough to make me deeply satisfied and happy. This state of consciousness lasted at least about 5 minutes and lingered for hours. And even though this experience is many decades old by now, it still hasn't faded completely. Another time, on an early Sunday morning, I was walking over the path in the dunes near the village where I grew up, looking for birds. It was foggy, and eventually I came across a lake with a small island in the middle, covered with tall bushes. A veil of mist hung over the almost ripple-free water, and the sun peeped over the cloud rim of the retreating night. A single duck, floating sleepily on the water, slowly became visible. The reed beds that bordered this oasis stood still, as if waiting for the first breeze of the day. It was as if I had walked through an invisible gate into another dimension, freed from time, thoughts, and body. My consciousness consisted of nothing other than the acceptance of beauty and harmony. Again, there was no need to describe nor to understand. The knowing in itself was sufficient. The author uses the concept of reflexive doubt. The unknown is not only threatening these days, but also irresistibly attractive, because where there are gaps, there are possibilities. But only when the awareness breaks through that behind every discovery a boundary appears, beyond which the unknown is, does reflexive doubt come into the picture. Reflexive doubt is incessant questioning, like I did as a child during those anxious moments in bed. The fact that there are no conclusive answers to almost all questions about meaning does not prevent the reflexive doubter from asking them. After my toddler and preschool years of blissful ignorance, when I realized mortality also applied to me, I eagerly started looking for certainties. Initially with a conviction that they could be found, but soon knowing that I would never find them. According to one of the studies in the book, 60% of all people never concern themselves with the fact that they will die one day. It's precisely because I am concerned with this, although no longer obsessively but still quite intensively, that I need meaning. There is a religious desire hidden in wanting to know and understand the meaning. The Catholic faith I was raised in never really appealed to me. Practically every sermon was completely incomprehensible to me as a child. I racked my brain about this immaculate conception that was mentioned over and over again, within my culture where sex education was virtually non-existent. I had no idea what this could be, immaculate conception. And Jesus had died for our sins, but that was almost 2,000 years ago. How could he have known then what my sins would be today? And besides, how would his death back then help with that? In the Catholic congregation I grew up, nothing was explained on an understandable level. It remained completely abstract, and moreover, it was always cold in church, and the pews were hard. Later in life, Christianity mainly fascinated me from a historical point of view. I read a lot about the Gnostic movement, about the historicity of the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, and about the role of the Roman Church throughout the centuries. I mainly drew meaning from the somewhat popular idea that we ourselves have to give meaning to our lives. Still, the ultimate questions, those questions of the reflexive doubter, were never far away. My way of trying to give meaning to my life took on the form of writing. Even though writing is still very important to me, I realize very well that the real meaning of my output is such a small drop in the ocean of eternity that it does not even make the slightest hint of a ripple, which is fine. So I no longer believe writing is the meaning of my existence. As mentioned, the concept of reincarnation has my attention. The ideas of the all, from which all forms of consciousness originate and into which they are reabsorbed after their incarnations, appeals to me. But as of yet, I do not truly and unconditionally believe in it. It's more of an intuitive suspicion. The theory of the Akashic records also appeals to me. When I first heard about this immense repository of conscious experiences, I immediately had to think back on my childhood. I must have been 4 or 5 years of age when there was no doubt in my mind whatsoever about a reservoir above the clouds that stored everything I said and thought. But now I couldn't say for sure that the Akashic records truly exist. Among other interests and many thoughts regarding meaning, one may say that I have been flirting with various gods for quite some time now. Up until now, they are all optional for me. To be fair, faith is not all about thought or mental analysis. Faith, more often than not, is something irrational, something that common sense opposes. I can be jealous of people with a rock-solid belief in something metaphysical, and I respect everyone's faith, as long as they're not too evangelic about it. I've discovered that asking further questions soon ends up at the limits of my intellectual capacities. If we can understand something metaphysically, our thinking about it, certainly in connection with the meaning of our existence, will sooner or later run up against those limits. But as I said, where there are gaps, there are possibilities. These limits of thought give me the impression that there is something outside our thinking capacity that can definitely silence the questions of meaning. Precisely because I regularly bump into the limits of my thinking capacity, the suspicion grows that there is more beyond. But at the same time, that is how thin and fragile my faith is. It's nothing more than the realization that because I hit a wall in my thinking capacity, there has to be something beyond it none can see or analyze. The sporadic moments that I've glimpsed beyond that wall are those at the train station or along the shores of a lake in the dunes. And although these experiences usually do not last longer than a few minutes of our earthly time, there is this lasting memory of their limitlessness and timelessness. Only then everything is clear without any need for clarity or explanation. All questions have disappeared. In his book, Koert van der Velde investigates all the possibilities for an unbeliever to undergo a religious experience. For example, he discusses in detail the existence of religiously tinged art manifestations, such as the religious game in which live-action role players, so-called LARPers, dress up as a gnome, an elf, a witch, a wizard, or a monk. At a certain location, they play a game for days that presupposes a metaphysical theory of transcendence. The author writes about the visitors to such festivals. For them, it is a way to actively participate in religious rituals despite doubts and disbelief. The non-believing rally game can only be aimed at gaining philosophical insights, but the player can also be open to religious experiences. During a visit to the beautiful church of Velde, the author tries to empathize with the experience that a medieval person must have had. He also investigates walking a pilgrimage, mind-expanding substances, visitors or musicians of religious concerts, such as Bach's St. Matthew's Passion, or the beautiful opera Dialogue des Carmélites by Francis Poulenc. The author characterizes this opera, one of my own favorites, as a religious opera. It tells the somewhat romanticized but true story of the martyrs of Compiègne, nuns of the Carmelite order who were guillotined during the Reign of Terror in the aftermath of the French Revolution. On July 17, 1494, 40 nuns and 2 external parties were beheaded because they refused to obey some constitution that would lead to the suppression of their order. This opera, and especially the ending, gives me goosebumps and a deep inner turmoil every time I listen to it. Is that a religious experience? Who can say? In his book, Van der Velde is looking for deep religious experiences, experiences that cannot simply be evoked. The experience of intentionality is difficult to control. Its influence lies somewhere between not completely and not at all. Time and again he has to conclude that he does indeed perceive a hint of religiosity in himself, but the real thing, a religious emotion to the depths of your being, remains unattainable. He tries to imagine how, for example, the visitors of rally fiction events or other events in which religiosity is deliberately evoked would experience this. Pretending apparently has a special effect. I will quote a few lines from Velde's book. Pretending offers the non-religious person the opportunity to try to make something of it in the religious field. Pretending offers the opportunity to actively engage in religious rituals and thus to strive for religious experience. During the game, attention is drawn to other aspects, and that is also why the status question disappears from view for a while. This does not solve it theoretically, but during the game, its importance disappears for a while. Here, the sobering effect of reflexive doubt changes into a religious one. The status question, or any question, disappears from view. That sounds a lot like my own words about all questions disappearing. It remains unclear whether, and if so, to what extent, visitors of a religious game are actually moved religiously. Although the author continues his investigation, I get the idea that an active search for religious rapture is pointless. Apparently, just as pointless is discovering the meaning of life. But that applies to the truly, deeply mystical experience, about which the 13th century poet Hadewig wrote some immortally beautiful verses. In them she describes in an almost erotic way the physical union of her soul with God. Almost every poem of hers seeks to cross the boundary and discovers what lies beyond normal human perception. If these experiences are so rare and cannot be summoned by sheer will, we will have to settle for less. The question is whether we can still speak of a religious experience, because it is indeed, as Velde himself indicates, difficult to determine its boundary. The distinction between religious and non-religious cannot be precise. Every boundary is arbitrary. It's a matter of, among other things, someone's personal taste and situation. This observation that a religious conception is a matter of taste recurs with great regularity in the book. According to Velde, the use of a high quality of religious experience requires good taste. In my personal search for religious rapture, or whatever comes closest, I quickly arrive at the arts, with music in the first place, literature in second, and visual arts in a good third place. Concerning these arts, I will limit myself to just a few examples. As for visual arts, entering religious buildings like the San Marco Basilique in Venice, the Santa Croce in Florence, cathedrals like in Orvieto, Chartres, Pisa, or one of the many churches in Ravenna can truly overwhelm me. The same thing happens to me with work of many painters, like Francis Bacon, Piet Mondriaan, Hans Memling, Gerard David. Whenever I visit Bruges in Belgium, I go to the Groothuizen Museum to admire this small wooden statue of Mary reading a book. This work by Adriaan van Wezel is of such unprecedented purity that it awakens an energy in my center that can represent little else than religious rapture. When it comes to literature, I find that only fiction can surprise me at times in a religious way. Non-fiction books provide me with information, and even though they can be very expertly written, they hardly ever astound me on an emotional level. Of course, there are exceptions like the books by Neil Donald Walsh. There are way too many inspirational writers and books that I could possibly mention here, so I simply won't. At the moment, fantasy can truly transport me to that other place where anything seems possible. Of the three arts mentioned, music most easily and most profoundly can evoke a religious experience in me. My musical taste is extremely diverse, with the two opposites being classical opera on the one side and progressive metal on the other. In between, there are lots of genres that I also like. Classical music overall guides me to religious experiences the easiest, like Wagner's opera Tristan und Isolde, the Adagissimo from Mahler's Ninth Symphony, Abendrot, the last of the Vier letzte Lieder by Richard Strauss, and much, much, much more. Inspired by Koert van der Velde, I have investigated my own desire for religiousness. No doubt I have that desire stemming from the many unanswered questions regarding meaning. Settling for what no doubt can be ranked as a surrogate in art is no punishment. And perhaps we should indeed, as van der Velde suggests, resign ourselves to our insignificance and be content with our mortality. Perhaps we should acknowledge that the truly divine is illusory, as are understandable answers to our questions. At the end of his book, Koert van der Velde recalls his special experience in the Sinai desert, which for him marked the beginning of a quest for personal experience. He wonders, did God flirt with me for a moment? I suspect that is what it is. During my own few deeply religious experiences in which the conflict within myself was resolved, God must have flirted with me. And during my experience of intimate beauty, it must be the other way around, when I flirt with God for a moment. Van der Velde mentions the tourists who visit a church like the one in Velde. They are not visiting the house of God, but a medieval work of art. The house of God is empty. His guests have disappeared from it. According to the writer, more and more people discover how to flirt with God. Although one may wonder, have people ever done anything else? In other words, there is essentially no difference between the believer and the non-believer who seeks religious ecstasy. If you have made it this far into the video, I thank you very much for watching. Until we meet again, at Dutch Greybeard.